Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the second FutureDAMS seminar. This is our the FutureDAMS will the project officially finishes in April of this year. So this is our last annual seminar series, and we have a seminar every 2 weeks. And this is the second of the series. The title today is The Economics of Infrastructure in East Africa. We have a distinguished panel that will be discussing this area, and we have our very own Mohammed Bashir, who's did a PhD in parallel to FutureDAMS, who will be presenting some work. And as a panelist, we have, in the order of my screen here, we have Dr. Claudia Ringler, who's at IFPRI. We have Dr. Abdul Karim Said, who's at IMI. We have Dr. Kalsadia, who's at UCL. And we have Dr. Ken Strespeck, who's joining us in a minute, and who's at MIT and at Boulder, Colorado. When they introduce themselves, they'll be discussants. They can say exactly what their role is in those organizations, because it switches around frequently. And then I'm Julian Haru. I'm the chair of water engineering at University of Manchester. And the speaker we have today will be Mohammed Bashir, who, like I said, was a PhD researcher. If I can just say 2 words about the topic, you know, the water, energy, food systems, these are engineered and natural systems. They combine elements of the natural world, like water resources, with human-made engineered systems like energy. And so if this is a natural and engineered system, you know, what business do economists have in there? Well, it turns out quite a bit. They have potentially quite a nice contribution to make, but it's not easy to combine physical science, engineering, and economics. There are many ways that can be done, and we can build these mathematical representations of these systems using the methods of those disciplines. But how useful are these methods? What can we really learn from them? What are the dangers of using them? What are the opportunities from using them? Are we not deluding ourselves in using these sophisticated tools? And what really is their place when we look at questions like how should water, energy, food, environment systems be developed to fit into political, social, and economic landscapes? Are these scientific methods appropriate, and can they really help society, and can they help countries progress? So those are the big picture questions we have today, and that's why we have such a varied group of discussants. And we have a researcher who has mastered both physical, engineered, and economic modeling, and we're going to hear what that has produced, and then we'll hear some reactions, and we'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll have questions from the audience. So we should be finished in about an hour and 15, an hour and 20 minutes. So thanks for joining, and let's first hear a talk from Mohammed Bashir. All right.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and for organizing this webinar. So today I'll be talking about some of the analysis that was done within the FutureDAMS project on infrastructure development and the economics of infrastructure development in East Africa. So this talk will involve work and contributions from multiple individuals within the FutureDAMS project, and will be presenting on their behalf. So I will try to cover 4 main points, hopefully very quickly. So first, I will talk about a modeling framework that we developed to kind of try to plan and simulate economic systems and river systems together. So it looks at the macroeconomics and river systems together. And then I will present an application that we did to the Nile Basin using that framework. And then I will talk very briefly about ongoing work about climate change impacts on the Nile and how to involve that in the future into socioeconomic and biophysical assessments of infrastructure investments. And then I will close with some concluding remarks. So as we all know, water, energy, food, and economy systems in the context of river basins are inherently interlinked. So, for example, water availability affects irrigation and municipal water supplies and then hydropower generation. But on the other hand, you've got also economic performance, and economic growth also affects the demands for resources like water, energy, and food. So the broad question that we're trying to answer here is, if we try to plan and simulate water, energy, food, and economy systems in an integrated way, would that help us look at elements of the systems that we weren't able to look at previously? Would that help us make better resource and infrastructure decisions? Yeah, so river system models is a classical approach used to look at the direct impacts of interventions in river systems. So with a river system model, which is a network representation of elements in the river system. So you've got different water users, you've got different infrastructure driven by boundary conditions like inflows and operating rules. With such kind of models, you can look at how crop yields are performing under different conditions. You can look at how municipal and industrial water users perform and whether they get their demands or not. You can look at how electricity generation through hydropower is affected. But then river system models are quite detailed, and they follow a partial equilibrium approach, which does not look at the indirect impacts or impacts on secondary markets. So that led us to thinking about bringing in a more holistic approach through computable general equilibrium models, which look at the economy at large and look at the interlinkages between different economic sectors. But then also it doesn't have the detailed representation that we have in the river system models, and it follows a different approach in allocating resources over time. So we try to bring these two modeling approaches together by providing information from the river system model to the economy model through changes to agricultural yields, annual water supplies, and hydropower, and a very simple representation of non-hydropower generation. But also on the other hand, economies affect the demands for resources. So depending on economic growth, you could have different demands for water and for electricity, for example. So we also have a feedback effect from CGE models to river system models. So how we implemented that in our models. So the flow chart you see on the right side kind of summarizes the approach that we use to link the two models. And we named this framework a co-evolutionary framework because the idea from it is that it brings together the river system component and an economy-wide modeling component and have them co-evolve over time and try to ensure coherence in the status of common features in the two modeling components. So the framework, with the flowchart you see on the right-hand side, I'm not going to talk too much about that, but it shows how the two components interact and communicate over multi-year simulations. So here, the simulation starts with a simulation from the economy component, which is normally driven by exogenous factors like investment behavior, labor growth, factor productivity, and so on. Based on that, we can look at how the demands for resources change over time. And then we feed that information to the system model, which normally has smaller time step like monthly or daily, or perhaps even sub-daily. And then within one annual time step of the economy model, the river system model performs multiple time steps and allocates resources based on the physical constraints of the system. And then provides information to the economy component on the actual amount that can be provided to the systems based on the physical constraints. So this iterative process continues between the two modeling components over one annual time step until a convergence status is reached, at which the two models move to the next time step. So that's how multi-year simulations are done in our modeling framework, two modeling components that follow different approaches but communicate annually using an iterative process to make sure that the status of the two components is coherent. Also, we've realized that large infrastructures can imply special financing conditions, and also the construction of large infrastructures is a quite a significant activity within, especially for small economies, notably when the piece of infrastructure is large. So that led us to trying to introduce more detail into how infrastructures are simulated within the economy models by adding more interactions between governments that often back large infrastructures in developing countries. So the interaction between government accounts and the rest of the world in terms of financing the infrastructure and in terms of implementing the infrastructure. So financing could come from the rest of the world in terms of bonds, grants, or foreign loans. And then you've got the construction of the infrastructure itself requires payments to the rest of the world on the national economy, depending on the specification of the certain infrastructure. So in total, we implemented 4 approaches to financing infrastructures within the CGE models: government bonds, foreign loans, foreign grants, and government spending. And the idea is that when we simulate a certain infrastructure in the modeling framework, we're looking at the biophysical impacts from the river system model, where we're looking at the economy-wide impacts, which also involve how that infrastructure is financed and how the construction, how long the construction is taking place, and where the resources for that construction is coming from, because these will have also economy-wide effects together with the biophysical impacts. Then in terms of tools, in order to implement the framework, we relied on open source tools so that the model can be easily reproduced and used widely. So we use 3 modeling tools. For economy-wide simulations, we use the IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute standard open source CGE model. So we started from that, and then we modified it to what we need. And for river system model, we use PyWR, which is also an open source Python library for simulating resource system networks. And then to link the 2 modeling components to manage their time stepping, iteration, and exchange of information, we used another open source Python library called Pinsip. Now, after we built that framework, we applied it on the Nile, trying to look at different ways to operate infrastructures and how that impacts the river system and also the macroeconomies. So just some basic information, some geography about the Nile. It's one of the longest rivers in the world, and it has a basin that extends over 11 countries. And the map on the right side shows the boundary of the Nile basin. It has 3 main tributaries: the White Nile, which originates on the Equatorial Lakes region here. You've got the Blue Nile, which originates on the Ethiopian highlands, and the Takizi Adbara, which also originates on the Ethiopian highlands. The Nile normally refers to 2 main regions. So there is the Eastern Nile region, which is shown as a hashed area here in the on the map, and then you've got the Equatorial Lakes region. The Eastern Nile, the area of the Eastern Nile, which is the hashed area, is around 60% of the area of the Nile basin, but contributes on average around 85% to the annual stream flow of the Nile as measured near the Sudan-Egypt border. One of the challenges in managing the Nile water resources is its high variability, both from one year to another and within the year. The plot you see on top here shows the interannual variability of the Nile stream flow. So here we're looking at an index called the standardized stream flow index. So whenever this index is below 0, which is a negative value, this indicates a below normal year, and blue columns here indicate above normal years. So what we can see, there is fluctuation between above and below normal years, but also moving towards the 21st century, we can see there that the frequency of having successions of above or below normal years has been increasing. If we look at the plot on the lower plot, this shows the contribution of the main tributaries of the Nile to the Nile flow at the Sudan-Egypt border. We can see that the Blue Nile contributes the highest volume with around 7%. And it is highly variable with around 80% of the flow occurring in only 4 months of the year, from July to October. The White Nile flow is relatively regular compared to the Blue Nile, But overall, the Nile flow is quite variable within the year. So the large infrastructure that we try to look at in our analysis is called the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or the GERD, which is currently under construction here near the Sudan-Ethiopia border. When completed, this dam, I'll be calling it the GERD from now on. The GERD will be the largest hydropower facility in Africa in terms of power generation capacity, and will generate an estimated 13.7 terawatt hour. This is estimated at a 90% energy power reliability. And it will have a reservoir volume of 74 billion cubic meter, which is capable of storing around 1.5 times the average annual flow at the dam location. So it will introduce significant changes to the natural inter-annual variability of the river flow. There is currently disagreement between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt on how this dam should be operated. So what we're trying to do using that modeling framework is look at different ways to operate this dam, and then look at how that impacts the river system, but also some economic metrics. So how we implemented the framework, we built a river system model for the Nile Basin. And then we connected it through PINSIM, which I talked about earlier, to CGE models of Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. In the river system model, we included very simplified representation of non-hydroelectricity generation for each of the three countries, basically to try and fill the gap between hydropower generation and electricity demand. This is certainly an area that could be improved in the future through specialized power system models. So this is on the right-hand side, what you see here, this is a schematic of how the river system model looks like. So we basically take the system and break it down into nodes and links, and then introduce the inflows and the operating rules of the system. So overall, the model includes 210 inflow, abstract, and reservoir nodes. So it's quite detailed representation of the system. And then we drove the system by 102 river flow sequences because there's uncertainty about the future. We don't know how the future hydrology is going to be. Just looking at hydrologic uncertainty, that's without looking at the non-stationarity component. So that's why we generated multiple hydrologic sequences that are based on the historical hydrology. So here we're not looking at climate change really, but we are trying to look at how hydrologic uncertainty would affect system performance. So what we tried to look at is comparing two ways to operate the GERD. So the first one is a proposal that has been discussed in late 2019 and 2020 between the three countries. Normally referred to as the Washington draft proposal, in which, and this proposal eventually wasn't acceptable to Ethiopia for many reasons. But within this proposal, there were multiple ways to manage droughts. There are drought mitigation measures by ensuring minimum annual releases for minimum year average annual releases on 5-year minimum average annual releases. What we tried to do is to simulate a proposal, not exactly the Washington draft proposal, but one that resembles that proposal. And then we move towards a more coordinated strategy by having more coordination between large reservoirs. So what you see, the flow chart on the right-hand side shows that coordinated strategy. So the rationale behind that coordinated strategy aims for some measure of hydro solidarity, where political boundaries are relaxed, but with some national goals remaining. This coordinated operation enables Ethiopia to avoid the minimum releases from the GERD that are part of the Washington proposal, and provides flexibility in the operation of the dam. But with that coordinated strategy, water releases from the GERD always ensure the satisfaction of water consumption targets on the Blue Nile and Main Nile in Sudan. Also, with coordinated operation, GERD releases aim to satisfy consumption targets in Egypt when the storage of the High Aswan Dam falls below 50 billion cubic meters. We describe this strategy as neighbors looking out for each other, especially during multi-year droughts where consumption targets are met in the downstream, but more flexibility is provided in operating the GERD. So looking at some results of comparing these two ways of operating with the GERD. So here we're looking at coordinated operation minus the Washington draft proposal in terms of system operation. So here we're looking at how irrigation water use in Egypt is changing when taking this coordinated operation minus the Washington draft proposal. So each of these gray lines represents one of the 102 river flow sequences that we examined. So this represents the range of hydrologic uncertainty because the performance under different hydrologic conditions would be different. So overall, we can see here on this side the change in irrigation water use in Egypt. We can see a positive impact of moving towards more coordination, but also looking at if we accumulate the values over 30 years for each sequence and then plot them probabilistically, we can see that the highest kind of increase in Egypt's irrigation water use could get close to 30 billion cubic meters over 30 years. Looking at the Ethiopian side, we can see also hydropower or energy generation from the GERD would increase in most scenarios. Perhaps there are some fluctuations up and downs, but overall there's a positive impact. If we look at that probabilistically by accumulating values over 30 years, we can see predominantly there is a positive impact on electricity generation from the GERD. Now, looking at the economic side, how would this change in operating the GERD impact the GDP of Egypt based on the economic component of the modeling framework? So what we see here on this plot is the change in the Egyptian GDP discounted at a 3% rate. So here, this is in billion US dollars. And we can see again that there is also a predominant positive impact on the Egyptian GDP as a result of coordinated operation compared to the simulated Washington draft proposal. If we accumulate these values, we can also see that the positive impact, that positive accumulated impact could go up to 4.1 billion US dollars under some hydrologic conditions. But also there are some years with some slight declines in accumulated GDP of around minus 0.7 billion US dollars. But the positive impact is a lot higher and is more probable. Now, these are the results that we've done on the Nile using this modeling framework. And if you are interested in reading more about this study and the modeling framework and how we applied it to the Nile to look at these two different approaches, I invite you to read this paper, which we published last year in Nature Communications. So the last point that I want to talk about very briefly is climate change. And all the results that I presented so far on the Nile were based on hydrologic conditions that are built from the historical hydrology without taking any impact of climate change. But of course, climate change is expected to impact the river system. The plots we see here on this screen are some earlier results were also done as part of FutureDAMS with the hydrology and the climate modeling teams. So here we're looking at how the naturalized flow of the Nile is projected to change. And these plots show the 30-year moving average of the annual naturalized flow of the Nile. In some scenarios, we can see that the Nile is, for example, projected to have up to 120% increase by the end of the century, or over the period 2020 to 2100. But also the other tributaries of the Nile, the Blue Nile, the White Nile, and the Tekizi Atbara, are also expected to have that uncertainty. And these uncertainty could be different for different tributaries. Different lies here are based on different climate projections, of course. So here are some of the climate projections that we looked at. What these plots tell me is we really don't know a lot about the future. There's high uncertainty about the future, which calls for new ways to think about the planning problem and how to address future uncertainties. Climate change is not going to affect stream flows only, but also affect agricultural water demands. And the plots you see on the right side here, these are also projected changes in potential evapotranspiration from some irrigation schemes in the Nile system. So here, for example, the Nile Delta or the Jazeera Managil in Sudan or other locations and we can see that there is an increasing trend of evapotranspiration, but also an increasing uncertainty about how climate change is going to affect evapotranspiration in the future. This increasing trend implies increasing irrigation water demands in the future. The same applies to open water bodies. So evaporation from reservoirs is also expected, the potential for that evaporation is expected to increase in the future with climate change, which implies also more water leaving the system. So together with that, with the increase in potential evapotranspiration from irrigation schemes, more pressure is expected on the water resources of the Nile. So I would like to conclude by just mentioning 4 points that I already mentioned in the presentation, but just to summarize, the modeling framework that we developed within FutureDAMS showed us that modeling the interdependence of river systems and macroeconomies offers an approach to assess some direct and indirect impacts of large infrastructure. The economy-wide impacts of large infrastructure finance is also important in economy-wide assessment studies. But again, we have also realized that economy-wide models don't capture all types of impacts, and that additional approaches would be needed to complement river system models. So for example, environmental impacts or populations that will be affected through resettlement by large infrastructures, these need to be assessed separately. And then lastly, climate change is expected also to impact the river system, the biophysical and socioeconomic system, both of them together. And these should be incorporated in future analysis of infrastructure development in East Africa. These, of course, are still underway under FutureDAMS, and we hope to have some results in the near future on that. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention. I'll leave it here.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much, Mohammed. That was a great talk, and congratulations on that paper. Okay, let's turn to our panelists. We have a great panel, and so okay, we've seen some integrated water and river basin modeling. What are these tools good at? What are their limitations? Should we be using these for decision making? In what ministries? At what organizations? What are the limitations? Could we make mistakes by following the results of these models? So please, discussants, take a big picture view here. Of course, engineers and economists, we can model whatever we want, but is it really useful? Will this serve the communities of these areas that we're modeling? So our first discussant will be Claudia Ringler of IFPRI. Please, discussants, try to keep your initial remarks to 3 or 4 minutes, and then after that we'll have a more dynamic discussion. So Claudia.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, first, thanks for inviting me to this very exciting seminar on combining economic and hydrological and also climate change analysis with an example for the Eastern Nile Basin. So, I mean, I think the question is very pertinent because there are very few ministries of finance and very few economists who currently do consider changes in water availability, climate variability, climate change in economic analysis. And I think what Mohammed showed us today is the importance of the mistake of not doing so. So I think what Mohammed showed us is a very complex analysis, and I probably would have some questions on how he optimized across the various CGU models. But why do we need this? It's very simple. So a Ministry of Finance wants to invest, let's say, in a municipal water supply system, or they want to invest, let's say, in a hydroelectricity dam or in a road, right? And if they assume that water is always available for these investments to achieve its economic rate of return, then they will completely overestimate the economic benefits. So the benefits to GDP growth, the benefits to poverty alleviation, whatever the goals of the Ministry of Finance or whoever or the government are. If climate variability and water variability are being considered in these analyses, then rates of growth will be lower on average, and poverty alleviation achievements will also be lower. So I think that's the first important insight, and that's one of the key reasons of why climate and water resources need to be considered in these large long-term investment analysis. The second reason is that while we, on average, will see lower benefits, we will see differential changes in the benefits. So some investments will come out better, for example, irrigation, because of its drought reduction potential, given especially with climate change and growing droughts. Other investments will come out, will rank somewhat lower. So I think that's obviously the second reason of why we need to consider that. And I think what Mohammed showed us, the third reason is that given those differential impacts of different infrastructure investments in different locations, there is a very strong potential for cooperation and for linking, for changing water allocation rules, for linking between upstream and downstream countries. So I think that's the very third benefit, and this very large, I think, economic potential of very limited cooperation. That was not a joint optimization. This was a very limited cooperation, but still very large economic benefits. I think that's the third reason of why these kind of analyses are important. And we certainly should start, going beyond analysis and incorporate these kind of findings into decision-making processes. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Claudia. Yeah, it is remarkable. I mean, this analysis didn't actually use the multi-objective optimization that we've been using in the future. This is a relatively simple analysis, which is looking at the integrated simulation of the system. And so next I'll turn to Dr. Abdul Karim Said. Abdul Karim has been in the Nile Basin Initiative for many, many years. He's well known to many people around the world who are interested in the Nile, and he's known to everyone in East Africa. He's now the country representative for Ethiopia and the regional representative for East Africa at IMI. And so we're delighted to have him. Abdul Karim, we've met about, in fact, you invited me to a workshop on hydroeconomic models in Entebbe maybe 5 years ago, and Claudia was there as well, and many other people, and Ken Stresbeck as well. But have we evolved at all? Is this something that we actually should be doing? Do you think that this can help people on the ground? Is this more of an academic exercise? Let us know what you think for real, Abdul Karim. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and very nice presentation. I also went through the paper you shared with me. Really very interesting, bringing the economic side or aspect of especially regional infrastructure planning in the Eastern Nile, basically in the Nile. This was when I was working for NBI. We were actually kind of reaming through this for quite some time, and NBI has completed, actually before I left, what we call hydroeconomic optimization. I think the approach which Mohammed Bashir presented is quite different. In that you just said it's not really as such multi-objective optimization, but more like simulating both the economy-wide situation of the three countries together with the infrastructure. In that respect, I really liked it very much. It's very good because especially the co-evolution part is really good in my view, because one is informing the other, or one is influencing the other rather, so that we don't overlook it. We are not just one-sided, because if you just do optimization assuming things are the same for the coming 20-30 years, then obviously you'll be missing a lot, because you're making so many assumptions which may not hold at all, and then especially the feedback loop is not there. So from that perspective, I like this approach very much. And yes, I mean, the usefulness really depends. Maybe we'll discuss this more later on. It really depends upon for what purpose you want to use them, in my view. And then the other thing is how they are constructed, because inherently, I think what I have seen in the paper, this is taking a planning horizon about 30 years, from 2020 up to 2049 or so. Correct me if I'm wrong. So now over this 30 years period, now so many things change, especially in this region, the Eastern Nile region. What I mean by that is now you have to assume certain pattern of water use, for example, demand growth. I mean, I know it's informed by the economy itself in the model, but there are certain things which you assume for the coming 30 years, and especially if we are when we look into the Eastern Nile, and especially in the upstream part of Eastern Nile, many things are very dynamic. Population is growing at a very, very fast rate, and the energy demands are growing, the water and the food demands are growing. So if you see the past 20 years, the construction of, the pace of dam construction has increased in the last 20 years. So we had the Meroe Dam, we have the Tekeze 5 Dam, we have the Gerd Dam in Ethiopia, and we have so many others in other countries in the region as well. So I think, again, how useful this exercise, it is going to be very useful, but how useful it will be, it really depends upon how you are going to capture those kind of dynamics in the system. If the infrastructure backbone is remaining the same, but rather probably certain things are being changed in the planning horizon, maybe we are going to miss certain things. And then that makes it, like, reduces the usefulness of the model, the system. So I find them very useful, but it really depends upon how they are constructed, what assumptions they are making about the future, especially in the Eastern Nile. Because there are so many things changing, especially when it comes to infrastructure. And sometimes the decisions to build a dam or to build an irrigation infrastructure may not be only economics. Sometimes there are also other reasons why they are constructed, and these kind of things are difficult to capture. So now that brings me to a point. Is it wise to take 30 years time, for example, as the planning horizon for the analysis? Or is it better to have like piecemeal, like 10 years, step, so that, this, whatever we're making as assumptions are really more realistic and then more close to what's really going on the ground? This is one thing. It just put like a question. Second thing is how useful they will be really depends upon, again, how close you will be to the real life problem. What I mean by that is, especially those making decisions on infrastructure, they need probably to be involved, in my view. So they need to be involved, and then we need to understand, how they really make decisions. Especially the fact that we have just information may not be sufficient, and also how this analysis are really interlinked with other or inform other processes on investments. For example, if you come to the Nile Basin Initiative, in the Nile Basin, the NBI is working now on a comprehensive basin-wide investment program. So Professor Harbi, I think you have some idea from our earlier discussion. So probably this could be one of the inputs into that investment program design, because that is very important. So when it comes to informing investment decisions, now then we have to distinguish between national decisions and regional decisions. All right. So like when it comes to regional kind of problem you analyze, the GERD, you also mentioned it in the paper, it really takes a lot of time until agreements are made and decisions are made and so on. But if you come to at a national level, probably decisions are made faster than at regional level. This is one aspect you need to consider. The other is we have also continental-wide investment programs like the NEPAD, or the PITA, for example, like Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. Those are the kinds of, probably at the regional level, and the NBI program I mentioned, the kinds of investment programs to which this kind of work could fit, in my view. And they can definitely provide a very useful insight into the kind of infrastructure configuration we need to think about. Third, what I would like to say really is, again, for what purpose we use them is very important for me. It's not like to make a final decision based on the recommendations here, but rather probably this might be useful for narrowing down the discussions to around few options, right, as informed by the analysis. So instead of like searching the entire universe, probably this analysis would help us to narrow down to a couple of options, which, if it is a national decision, maybe the relevant sectors would sit and then discuss them. If it is a regional one, again, the different countries would sit around and then maybe explore more into those options which are narrower. So it's like kind of shortlisting of key options which the countries could take into account. Because usually when you are more prescriptive, then it's difficult for other decision makers really to take them on board. So this is.
Thank you so much, Abdul Karim. Abdul Karim, of course, is very well has been using models to assist decision makers in this region. So he's really has an expert perspective, and he brought up this topic, Abdul Karim, absolutely, of if the future supply, demand, and assets which are in place are different from the ones that were simulated here, what does that mean about the robustness of the results? So thanks very much for that. Let's quickly get some initial statements. I know Claudia and maybe Mohammed want to respond to some of those, but let's quickly move first to Ken Strespeck, if he's there. Ken, are you there from MIT and the
Yes.
University of Colorado? Go ahead, Ken.
Hear me?
3 or 4 minutes if you can, Ken.
Great. So I just want to thank you for inviting me, and I want to jump off and basically concur with both of the previous speakers, Claudia and Abdul Karim, and agree 99% with everything they said. What I want to add is 3 more points, which was brought up earlier about methodologies. One question that came out is, in doing investments, classically, we've done benefit cost analysis. Do economy-wide models fit into that? And the answer is yes, they can. And if you look back to some of the early work by the leaders and founders of BC analysis, Steiner and some of the others, and then recently by Hal Varian, they all point out that why benefit cost books are so big when we try to explain benefits is we're trying to, without using general equilibrium, come and get the 0, first, second, and third order effects, which are the general equilibrium effects. So these are exactly what we want to know is what are the ripples through the economy, and that's what computable general equilibrium models do. Then the question becomes, number 2, why don't we just use partial equilibrium models or other things? Well, back in '95, Yates et al. Did a study with the IASA on the value of water in Egypt, looking at a CGE model and then a partial equilibrium model. And what was shown there is one of the big things about general equilibrium models, they tend to be solved annually. So you're looking at annually, and before they were national, but now we can get some regionality into it. But back then it was national and annual. And so many things related to water are seasonal. And our partial equilibrium models allow us generally to go into a monthly scale or at a minimum of a seasonal scale. And that can be really critical, that the value of water may spike in certain seasons, and where irrigation and infrastructure matters is allowing for a second crop or allowing for other things. So what that work suggested, and it's also what's been trying to be done by the work in this paper and another paper by Bollett et al. In a work at IFPRI called CGEW, is linking the two together, a partial equilibrium with the general equilibrium. And so, as they say in South Africa, horses for courses, that we want to use the right tool. And then finally, one of the things that's really important in all of this work is that we catch the nonlinearities of it. So sometimes people use economy-wide models and use linear input-output models or simple linear extrapolations. And the problem is water generally in sectors is not linear. The shape of the response curve is very nonlinear. And as you increase the use, the marginal value of that water goes down. And then finally, in the Nile area, one of the key things of this is not every kilowatt hour of hydropower has the same economic benefits to the 3 countries being discussed, because we're looking at things at the margin. One more unit of hydropower in Ethiopia or Sudan will have a different value to the economy, to the welfare of people than you would see in Egypt, for example. And that's one of the things that we want to look at. These tools allow us to do that. And then finally, to respond to Abdul Karim, and you used the famous word robustness, one of the things that we do is look at the alternative scenarios. Let's look at high growth, low growth, and go that way and see how robust those decisions are to potential futures and see the risk that we have. So with that, I'll sign off. And again, thank you for allowing me to participate.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks. And it's great to have Ken. Ken is one of the few in the world and one of the very first with people like Claudia who have undergone formal education in both economics and engineering. So we're great to hear those technical contributions. Thanks very much, Ken. And finally, we have a pure card-carrying macroeconomist in the form of Alvaro Calzadilla from UCL, and he's going to tell us, why engineers should could and should use these results from these economic models. So Alvaro, good to have you.
Yes, thank you very much, Julian. And thank you, Mohammed, for the nice presentation. You show in 20 minutes what we have been doing the last 4 years. And it clearly, with your presentation, we can see the difficulties and challenges in balancing the needs of different users. So we have, for example, electricity production, irrigation, water, and different countries in the Nile. So we focus on Ethiopia, Sudan, and the Nile. And one of my key points, I mean, besides the modeling framework that we have created, which I think it is quite advanced and unique, is the potential use of this framework to inform the policymakers. Right, and we have seen, as an example that you have shown, the role of cooperation in such a dynamic and complex system. So we do really need this type of models in order to summarize the complexities for the policymakers. And this is the point that I wanted to do. Another point that came to my mind now is that in general, most of the analysis looking at infrastructure investments focus on the service that these infrastructure provide. But we have seen as well with the work that we have done that construction is very important. A dam could cost millions of dollars, and then this could basically mobilize a lot of resources to the construction sector, right? And it will generate employment benefits and so on. So this is important to take into consideration as well, these sources, I mean, the construction of this infrastructure, but not only the construction, but also where the money is coming from. So if we are going to finance this with internal funds or with external funds, and also what are the conditions, what are the interests that the government will pay for that. I mean, those key economic aspects will make the difference and will add to the economic benefits of constructing the dams. And of course, as you have seen, the operation then of the infrastructure is key in order to balance these trade-offs between different sectors, different agents, and different interests as well. So that's my initial point, Julian.
Great. Let's get a quick, so thanks for all those respondents. Thank you very much. Mohammed, do you mind if I just ask you to just about that time, the time duration, technical point from Abdul Karim, and then do you want to react 1 minute, Mohammed? Anything you want to say in reaction to those four? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for this excellent feedback. So on that time horizon, I mean, for me as a modeler, my worst nightmare is uncertainty about the future. So yeah, so we normally try to simulate long enough period to try to capture the cycles, the hydrological cycles, because we have large dams in the systems now. So simulating 10 years might not help us understand the full cycle of going into a drought and going out of a drought. But on the other hand is the point that Abdul Karim mentioned, which is very valid, is that we have high uncertainty about the future and the system is quite dynamic. And at the same time, there are no clear plans that are published by countries regarding when they're going to build new assets or how their demands are going to change in the future. So that's certainly something that needs to be looked at. And I think one way to address it is to look at a range of uncertainty and try to design plans that can address this uncertainty.
Okay, thanks very much. Mohammed. Okay, so now we have about maybe 10-15 more minutes for just conversations with the panelists. We had sent out a few bullet points. The second one comes to my view here. You know, Ken Stressbeck spoke of the more traditional cost-benefit analysis models. And it seems to me that what we're talking about here is kind of the Rolls-Royce, right? If you're taking a multi-country CGE and connecting it to the full engineered model, you know, this is not something everyone can afford. It's kind of the Rolls-Royce. You know, we have different actors like investment banks, MDBs, which are typically looking at investment by investment. And can we just pause and think for a minute, how much, you know, do we get the wrong answer if we just do a cost benefit analysis, which looks at one dam and doesn't look at the whole system scale impacts and how they reverberate? and iterate between economic impacts and engineered service impacts. Do we make mistakes? Can we still afford, and should the World Bank be using CBA and different infrastructure banks? Or, can we afford to do that? Or are there clear mistakes? Or, and so Ken started talking about this, but I was wondering if we get, I know there's at least one World Bank person in the audience. Should we, for such big integrated systems, can we afford to still use kind of single asset CBA cost benefit analysis? Is this system scale analysis a luxury or something that we really must do? Any ideas from the respondents?
Julian, yes, I'll just step in. The World Bank is already moving ahead in that world. To explain, for Indonesia on their water security analysis, I was part of a team that undertook a CGE analysis tied with a series of biophysical models, linking them together. And so that has gone forward. They've done the same thing for Zimbabwe. And most recently, I just completed work where the city of Cape Town, under the World Bank funding, was looking at the expansion of what's called the Western Cape water supply system. And they realized the need for this. So under Diego Rodriguez and Nicholas, they hired a few local firms, and we put together a CGE of the Western Cape linked to a systems model, just like Mohammed did here, for the exact purpose that you're talking about. So it is getting out there and it's getting utilized in the world right now, and we will be using that in the future for, I think, throughout the bank. But horses for courses, we don't need it everywhere, but where it's available and can be used, I think it's a wonderful tool.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Claudia, you were going to react. Claudia, is this something that Ken and his friends can use, or is this something that's accessible to a wider group?
No, I mean, I guess first it would be good to hear from the participant from the World Bank as well. But yeah, I guess just to support what Ken said, I think the bank has been doing climate change impact assessments for Bangladesh using CGE models, Northern Ghana, infrastructure investment. So yes, basically, yes, the bank is using it increasingly. And I guess for the kind of infrastructure that we're talking about here in the Eastern Nile, or like the Fomi Dam in the Niger. So those very, very large dams with reverberating impacts downstream. So I think that's one of the reasons this kind of integrated assessment, there's no way to not use this kind of integrated assessment. And I think so both the size of the infrastructure, the non-climate change reverberation cascading impact downstream, also meaning the opportunity cost of non-collaboration that's going downstream. So yeah, so basically it's a yes. But at the same time, in the, I think, final decision-making processes, so that is why it would be good to hear from the World Bank. I think their, the more traditional analysis still prevail. So I think there are these additional studies that are being done to better understand some of the multiplier impacts and benefits. But in terms of decision-making processes, I don't think that they have dramatically changed. And I do think additional change is needed there. But Julian, as you have said, so one thing is multilateral institutions, but obviously, as important or more importantly is how can we make sure that institutions on the ground, Nile Basin Initiative, countries, et cetera, are using the tools. We know that they're using CGE models. And I think what we need to start with is to feed in climate variability into those models. Yeah, just build up slowly. So I mean, what Mohammed showed is such a complex system. That is definitely not that easy to grasp for the average policy and decision maker, because their job is very differently constituted. But to start to build up capacity on incorporating natural resources assessments, and someone said you can't assess environmental impacts, and yes you can. You can really expand those models and just have them talk with yet other models. And I think there's this Nexus Gains initiative that is trying to collaborate with FutureDAMS to broaden some of the environmental impacts in addition to the economic costs and benefits of these analysis. But so I think we need to build more capacity of the agencies in governments that are doing the investment plans and investment foresight analysis, and definitely there's more movement on the ground. But I think there's probably still an underinvestment in the actual capacity building piece. So yeah, just wanted to add that.
Okay, thanks, Claudia. I saw Alvaro, you raised your hand. Go ahead, Alvaro.
Yes, thank you. I agree with what Ken and Claudia has said and the potential utility of CG models because of the economy-wide view that it has and the consideration of direct, indirect, and induced effect, so we can have a clear picture of the whole impact and not only a specific project. But also we have to think on the limitations that the model has. So it's a model based on market, on markets. So if we do not consider no market analysis, for example, and most of the resources we need somehow to consider these limitations are probably to complement the CG analysis with this type of environmental impacts. And for example, when we construct a dam, we also have local impacts on the habitants living in the area. And we need to consider also these impacts of migration or displacement into consideration as well with the economic model. So I think it is a tool that we can use, but it needs to be complemented in order to consider these non-market aspects, which are as important as the economic aspects.
Abdul Karim, do you want to chime in on this, Abdul? Well, I guess Abdul Karim, your point's already raised this. Let me pass now to the next one, which I think Abdul Karim will want to react to as well. You know, what do we see as the main shortcomings of these methods, and how robust are they when, for example, for institutional change? We've in the FutureDAMS, we're working with the East African Power Pool, which has just told us that their target date for starting the East African Power Pool market is 2023. So there's soon going to be an energy market. Alvaro, you were saying that the CG model is assuming that market, but still, I mean, we would represent the energy, the power system with the engineered service tool like we have here for the river basin. So, for example, you know, what are the shortcomings of these models? And if there's major institutional change, like the adoption of an energy market, how does that change their applicability? So I'll let any of you intervene, but Abdul Karim, if you want to start about this question of what are the potential shortcomings of these methods, feel free.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much for this. And I agree with earlier interventions, especially regarding capacity building and a bit of awareness raising as well in my view on this, and especially among the planners in the region. But also, largely, these works are, I can say, externally driven, either from like international financing organizations or the academia, like, for example, what you're doing here. So as part of the capacity building, if they can be embedded as well in planning and institutions in the region, that might help probably. I mean, building the in-house capacity and making them, like, if I use the word, more mainstreaming the approach, at least the approaches, so that those plans at the national level will be informed by this kind of analysis. They don't need to do the analysis themselves probably, but they need to be informed by the analysis. So the fact that mostly they are somewhat externally driven is shortcoming, not necessarily in the methods themselves, but when it comes to the usefulness, as you have said earlier, the way they are constructed, the way, you know, the assumptions they make about the future, and the length of the future planning horizon they consider sometimes could reduce their usefulness. They are very useful, I think, and it's much more than the, for example, if I compare it like what they call optimization, probably the method you have presented is, in my view, far more superior in my view. So these are some of the things which we need to consider when we think of actually using them in practical decision making. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Abdul Karim. On this question of what are the shortcomings of these methods, how can we make sure we don't fall into those pitfalls, and you know, how do they adapt when there's institutional change, like you know, an active energy market which might start next year? I don't know, Claudia, Ken, Alvaro, any thoughts on that?
I mean, a few years ago, we did some, I'm not muted, okay. We did some energy systems modeling under the CGI research program on waterland and ecosystems with, with Ethiopia. And so we had the same, the same worries that, people move, institutions change, and that happened. The ministry name changed, and some of the functions of the Ministry of Water, Irrigation and Energy are not there anymore, which in this case didn't affect the energy side that much. So what we decided to do is to build a diverse and large national modeling group that was tasked to develop the database for the energy systems model. They got the software. There were various training events, of course, unfortunately affected by COVID-19 in the end. But so basically there is now a indigenous national modeling group that does have all the tools, and it has all the means to keep developing the system. And Abdul Karim, I see your point, constantly people from outside develop great models, and then there's not enough time, enough funding, or enough, you can't get enough people into capacity building events to retain those systems as national systems that can be developed by national actors. It's very difficult to overcome that, but I think it can be done. It's best done if you can connect to a national modeling system that anyway is already the identified and chosen system for national planning. So the CGE model is already a tool that the government of Ethiopia uses for its growth and transformation plans. The Egyptian government uses it, etc. I'm sure Sudan as well. I don't know the Sudanese system that well, but I think all three countries use this tool already. So if you can work with the modelers in the country that already use the tool, develop some capacity and some linkages between water agencies and meteorology, etc. system and these existing tools, and also add capacity at universities and at other agencies. I think that's something that we felt was very important, to not only embed the kind of capacity in the ministries, you have to embed it in the university system and other relevant agencies. And then hopefully you have a sufficient critical mass that when institutions change, when people move on, that you don't lose the capacity. But obviously the best insurance that the tools will not get lost is if they have been enshrined as part of national planning processes. And so I think it's feasible, but obviously there is a very big effort involved. And unfortunately, the way funding streams go, they're usually annual or 2 years. So yeah, unfortunately, for serious capacity building, we need a much longer time frame. But there are some ways to do that. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks both for those points. I mean, so of course, the term institutional change has many factors. I mean, one is retention of the knowledge and keeping, and Abdul Karim and Claudia have spoken about that. But how about other institutions? Are things like water markets, energy markets, the institutions that regulate how the countries interact. For example, this new energy market, Ken, that might happen, well, that the EAPP wants a new energy market, a spot market from next year. Does that mean all the previous economic modeling studies are going to be wrong because of this new market? Ken?
Well, I think that the issue is they're all wrong anyways.
Okay.
Are they wronger, to use that word? But I think one of the important things, and I want to draw on just one word that Claudia just said that emphasizes it, is what is the role of this type of models? And we want to be really careful. And then I'd like Dale, if he could add to this as, the president of the Society of Benefit Cost Analysis, how we end up making investment decisions. These tools are not the answer to that. They provide inputs to it because these models tend to be focused on indicators like GDP, which is just one indicator in an investment decision. But the other thing is they think they're really good for planning, but they're not good for design. They can help fit design, but where they fit, in an example from the Nile in Uganda, is how a tool like this was used is at cabinet level, the water ministry could never get money for WASH projects, water and sanitation projects. And they wanted GDP growth was the main thing. And every other sector would say, well, you're just a drain on the economy and you're putting wash does not help the economy. Well, a CGE analysis showed in 20 years, you could get a 9% increase in GDP if you invested in environment and water because of all the economy-wide benefits. So that didn't affect the design, but it now let the Minister of Water to be on equal footage and showed that investments in water were very similar to investments in roads and investment in the average of the energy production over the life of oil delivery. So those kind of policy things, but they weren't going into which dam in order on the Victoria Nile would be built or those kinds of things, but setting a policy level work and fitting them with narratives and being one of sort of many decisions that are made as a capital short country decides how they invest. So I think that's an important part of that, being used for planning and in bringing ministries of water and agriculture, environment to work with ministries of planning to use their tools and speak their language.
Alvaro, any points you want to? Alvaro, do you feel like you have many years of experience with CG models, these whole economy models? Do you think that they're brittle? And if there's major institutional change, do you feel like the results are brittle if they don't really apply after major changes like the introduction of an energy market at regional scale, for example?
Yeah, I mean, the good thing of a CG model is that it is based on real data, right? And that data in general is a past data, but the good the good thing of CG models are that they can be used in order to assess different policy changes, scenario changes. So if we do have a change in a market structure, then we could modify the model again and build it. I mean, to use the same model, I mean, it will depend how drastic is the change in the market in order to adapt the model that we have. But in general, I mean, it will require some modifications, probably to include new sectors, to change production structures in order to represent the new type of market structure. And of course, for this, we also need the linkages to physical models, to energy models, to see how this could look like. I don't know if that's a point that you wanted to make.
Okay, yes, thank you. That okay. Yeah, thanks, Alvaro. Sorry, I was looking at the chat. No, I think those are some very good points. We're soon going to go to questions from the audience, if there are any. And so please, for the moment, if you could type those in. Yeah, there's definitely, I don't want to pick on specific people too much, but I did notice that there's the representative of WWF globally on hydropower. Be really interested if there's a question from WWF. Does WWF think economic modeling should be used when looking at things like dams? Okay, so get ready, audience. We're going to quickly come to you and start putting some questions in the chat. In the meantime, you know, maybe if someone is burning to respond to this question in the panel, do you feel like there's some information gaps, or is there some obvious analyses and data gathering efforts that would make these model and these analysis tools more effective? And any that you'd like to mention. Unfortunately, I think the World Bank has left, but certainly Abdul Karim is on the ground in East Africa. It would be good now for us to think collectively, you know, are these input-output tables that we use sufficient, and do they have, you know, do they need to be updated? Any thoughts regarding East Africa? Anyone want to think about that last point before we go to questions from the audience? You're fully happy with the economic data tables that are as input? I think we got them from IFPRI.
Absolutely
so
not.
Absolutely not, says Ken.
No, I
okay,
mean,
Ken, then Claudia.
I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, what will always happen is it's a lot of work to have a good SAM, and the importance is a social accounting matrix, as well as the input-output table to do and look at the winners and the losers, and that's important. And there's two parts of that, and I'd love Claudia to add. But two things is, one is getting it as, because things are so dynamic, which everybody said, is we don't want to be using as our basis a model where huge policy has changed in the last 5 years, and we're not reflecting that in the current response to that, because the economy responds. So the working as best we can, but it's a constraint that's there. But also, secondly, is the start for some of your countries. Some of the countries here are very large, and trying to understand regional and what I call agroecologically zoned based data. So South Africa has something they call GGP, which is province level GDP that you can look at. And they started that in Kenya now. So knowing about the investments by region, so we can have subnational CGEs, and looking at those become important. So that would make it more useful. That's first and second order. We just need to get to good national numbers first, but we can always improve them to fit them closer to what we can do hydrologically, environmentally, and agriculturally. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe just quickly to add, I mean, first on the question, if we have an energy market, will that be a problem for the model? In fact, the model will be very happy. It works much better with functioning markets, and with markets that reflect, economic perspective. So that's a good thing if there are more serious markets in East Africa. On the key challenges on data, yeah, I mean, they're pervasive. I guess both from the water side, from the economic side, I think the key is to keep improving on them. I think one big challenge is industrial water use, and to what extent the absence or the availability of water generates industrial growth, because I think it's important for economic models. And then I think the other problem pretty much anywhere, certainly also in Sub-Saharan Africa, is the planning. So there's always this heroic plans of increasing irrigated area. There's sometimes nationally mandated numbers for irrigated area that don't necessarily reflect actual irrigated area on the ground, but some people have to use numbers because they're the numbers agreed at some ministry. But yeah, to get more realistic planning numbers that are actually achievable over the next 20 to 30 years, I think that remains a very big challenge. And that's why I guess we have to constantly do so many sensitivity and alternative scenario analysis. So I think those are our two gaps.
Okay, I see that we also have Victor Neshifor in the audience, who was one of the key authors of this study that Mohammed presented. Victor, sorry to put you on the spot here. Everyone was able to prepare, but you don't get that luxury. Any further data that you think? What would be the data set? Is it the SAM or any data sets that you think would improve this kind of analysis? Victor, are you there with us?
Yes, I'm here. Hello. Well, indeed, you put me under the spot because I don't really have a very specific answer to give to you. But I guess, yeah, I have to agree with Kenneth on the fact that, yeah, SAMs are absolutely important, and the level of detail that we have in them with respect to households, but also to, sectoral details specifically related to agriculture. Well, irrigation is not always very, very well represented in this type of models. Water is not very models, social accounting matrices. Water is not present in them. This is on the agricultural side, but also on the power sector as well, because there are so many interactions between hydropower development and the other sectors. Renewables are also a hot topic, right? I think it's interesting to have a higher level of detail in that area as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Victor, for coming in. Alvaro, a quick message for you, then I'll go from a question from the audience. So go ahead, Alvaro.
Yeah, sure. I mean, definitively a better data, which is the base of the model, is really good. But also we have to think how we are going to use the model. So we are going to basically construct some future scenarios, and then we also need data on the scenarios that we are constructing. And this is very much also related to the point that Mohammed raised before about the uncertainty. So we will have about uncertainty on how the water model basically moves or works into the future, the economic model as well, how climate change will impact the future, and also how the economy will look like into the future. So I think this type of information is also key in order to understand the size of the impacts, to know and to explore better the uncertainty on all these processes when we do these future analysis of different policies or changes like climate change.